The brutal execution of William Wallace was far more horrific than you imagine. Before he was a legend, William Wallace was a man with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. In a time when Scotland was buckling under English rule, Wallace exploded onto the scene with blood, fire, and an unshakable cry for freedom. He didn't just battle an empire. He ignited a movement that reshaped history. From guerrilla warfare to gruesome martyrdom, Wallace's life reads like a myth because much of it became one. But behind every legend is a real story, and we're about to uncover the man beneath the war paint. William Wallace's origins remain unclear and hotly debated. He wasn't necessarily a nobleman, at least not in the way Hollywood likes to pretend. Wallace came from the lesser Scottish gentry, possibly even a commoner with just enough status to get an education. He wasn't born into grand castles or royal courts, but he knew Latin, which set him apart. Wallace's rise wasn't about birthright, but boldness, brains, and battlefield grit. The man didn't inherit power. He took it. Wallace was born sometime in the early 1270s. Historians guess between 1270 and 1272, maybe in Elderslie, maybe Ayrshire. The records are a mess. What is clear, he entered a world already on fire, and that chaos didn't just shape him, it forged him. And soon, he'd strike back. In 1286, tragedy struck when King Alexander III died in a freak accident. His horse fell off a cliff during a storm. His only surviving heir was his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. When she died en route to Scotland in 1290, the throne was suddenly up for grabs. With no clear successor, 13 nobles laid claim, plunging the kingdom into chaos and making it ripe for outside interference. With Scotland leaderless, the nobles asked Edward I of England to mediate the succession crisis. Edward agreed, but only if Scotland acknowledged him as overlord. Desperate to avoid civil war, many nobles caved. That decision gave Edward a foothold in Scottish politics, and he took full advantage. He wasn't just settling a dispute, but setting the stage for domination. The Scots didn't know it yet, but they'd handed Edward the keys to their kingdom. Edward selected John Balliol as king in 1292, but it wasn't a gift. It was a leash. Balliol had the crown, but Edward called the shots. He demanded fealty, summoned Balliol to English courts, and overruled his decisions. Edward reduced a once proud kingdom to a glorified province, and the Scots began calling Balliol Tomb Tabard, meaning empty coat, for his lack of real power. Scottish independence hadn't just slipped away. It was being erased piece by piece, with English boots on Scottish soil. Edward's heavy-handed rule didn't sit well with the Scots. English officials collected taxes, enforced harsh laws, and occupied key strongholds. The nobility grumbled. The people suffered. Resentment simmered across villages and castles alike. Some tried to resist quietly through minor sabotage and whisper rebellion. Others bided their time, waiting for someone bold enough to strike back. Scotland wasn't at peace. It was holding its breath, teetering on the edge of revolt. Fed up with Edward's control, the Scottish nobles finally snapped. In 1295, they formed the Auld Alliance with France, a direct slap in Edward's face. England responded with fury. In 1296, Edward launched a brutal invasion, capturing Berwick and slaughtering thousands. He forced John Balliol to abdicate the throne, looted the Scottish crown jewels, and hauled off the Stone of Destiny. Scotland was leaderless, humiliated, and occupied, but in the ashes of defeat, the rebellion was about to ignite. In 1297, William Wallace emerged from the shadows of occupation and struck back. After years of watching his homeland buckle under English rule, Wallace led a surprise attack on the Sheriff of Lanark, marking the start of open rebellion. His bold strike electrified the Scots, whether driven by patriotism or personal vengeance. No royal blood, no official title, just fury, strategy, and a sword. Wallace wasn't following orders, making history on his terms. 9. Scotland rose with him. Wallace's attack at Lanark wasn't an isolated outburst, but a spark that lit the nation. As news of his defiance spread, ordinary Scots rallied to his cause. Farmers, laborers, and minor nobles joined the rebellion, tired of English taxes, violence, and control. Wallace wasn't a king or a noble general. He was one of them. His boldness gave Scotland something it hadn't had in years: a leader willing to fight back, no matter the odds. Advertisement. 10. He wasn't the only one. Wallace wasn't the only one putting up a fight. Sir Andrew Moray shared Wallace's passion against Edward I. The Morays of Petty were a powerful and influential family who owned vast lands and castles in northeastern Scotland, and they actively fought against English rule. Unfortunately, Sir Andrew Moray and his son, also named Andrew, were captured in battle. While the senior Moray didn't make it, the younger Andrew managed to escape and continue his father's legacy, eventually crossing paths with Wallace. 2 rebels, 1 goal. As William Wallace's rebellion spread in the south, Andrew Moray led a fierce uprising in the north. In 1297, the 2 freedom fighters united, creating a powerful, coordinated resistance against English occupation. Their partnership wasn't about titles or politics, but shared fury and strategy. Together, they built an army of farmers and fighters, ready to take on a vastly superior foe. Their first big test? Stirling Bridge. On September 11th, 1297, Wallace and Moray faced a massive English army at Stirling Bridge and rewrote the rules of war. While the English began crossing the narrow bridge, the Scots waited. Then, in a sudden assault, they trapped and slaughtered the soldiers who crossed, cutting them off from reinforcements. It was brutal, brilliant, devastating. Against all odds, the underdogs crushed one of the most powerful armies in Europe. Scotland didn't just win, it roared back to life. Victory at Stirling Bridge came at a cost. Though the Scots had triumphed, Andrew Moray suffered wounds during the battle and never recovered. He died later in 1297, robbing the rebellion of one of its sharpest minds and most dedicated leaders. His death left Wallace to carry the cause alone. Moray may not be as famous today, but Scotland's resistance might never have stood a chance without him. He was the co-architect of a national awakening. The English leader didn't just fall, he met a gruesome end. Following the clash at Stirling Bridge, Hugh de Cressingham, Edward I's top official and battlefield commander in Scotland, was slain amid the fighting. But Wallace's forces went even further. Chilling reports suggest his enemies desecrated his remains, using parts of his body to fashion items for their weapons. True or not, the story sent a brutal message. Wallace's uprising wasn't just political, but fueled by vengeance. William Wallace flayed Hugh Cressingham at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. William Wallace flayed Hugh Cressingham at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Drunk History UK. Comedy Century UK. Wallace rose to the top. Moray was gone, and Scotland was riding high after Stirling. In late 1297, the nobles named him Guardian of Scotland, a wartime leader acting in the king's absence. A commoner turned commander, Wallace now spoke on behalf of the nation. He wasn't just leading troops. He was shaping policy, forging alliances, and defending Scotland's fragile independence. For a brief, shining moment, a rebel without a title became the most powerful man in the kingdom. Get images. 51243130. Sir William Wallace circa 1300. Sir William Wallace. C.Point 1276, 1305. Scottish hero and soldier. Executed by the English. Hulton Archive. Getty Images. Edward I wasn't called a Hammer of the Scots for nothing, and in 1298, he brought that hammer down hard. Furious over Wallace's raids, Edward launched a massive invasion, leading his army personally into Scotland. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Falkirk. Though Wallace's forces fought bravely, English cavalry and archers overwhelmed the Scots. It was a brutal defeat. Wallace escaped with his life, but the tide had turned, and Scotland's hero was on the run. After the crushing loss at Falkirk, Wallace made a fateful choice. He stepped down. In 1298, he resigned as Guardian of Scotland, passing leadership to nobles like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Wallace knew the fight had to continue, even if he wasn't the one leading it. He faded from the political stage, but not from the struggle. His sword may have quieted, but his legend had only begun. In 1305, after years in hiding and exile, William Wallace was finally betrayed. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to Edward, captured Wallace near Glasgow. The betrayal stung even deeper because it came from one of his compatriots. Wallace had risked everything for Scotland's freedom, only to be handed over by a fellow Scot. It was a grim reminder that not all enemies wore English armor. Wallace's arrest marked the end of his long resistance. After evading capture for nearly a decade, he was seized and sent to London under heavy guard. To Edward I, Wallace wasn't a prisoner of war, but a traitor. The crown wanted a spectacle, and Wallace's fate would be a brutal warning to future rebels. But even in chains, Wallace refused to bow. His defiance would echo louder than any English verdict. Wallace's trial in London wasn't about justice. It was pure theater. Hauled before a hostile court in 1305, the English accused Wallace of treason against the English crown. The court decided the verdict before he even had a chance to speak. The trial wasn't about proving guilt, but making an example. And the punishment would be as brutal as possible. When accused of treason during his trial, Wallace delivered a line that echoed through history. "I could not be a traitor, for I never owed him allegiance." With those words, he didn't just defend himself, but challenged the legitimacy of English rule in Scotland. It was bold, unapologetic, and pure Wallace. He knew he'd die, but he wasn't about to die quietly. Even in chains, he spoke like a free man. On August 23rd, 1305, William Wallace met a horrifying end. The English dragged his battered body through the streets of London. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for the worst traitors. But instead of silencing rebellion, his execution turned him into a martyr. Wallace died in agony, but the cause he fought for lived on. Wallace's end wasn't enough for Edward I. He wanted to erase the man and the message. After Wallace's brutal execution, the English dismembered his body. His head was displayed on a spike atop London Bridge, while the English sent his arms and legs to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a warning. But instead of fear, it stirred fury. The English scattered his remains to silence rebellion. Yet all they did was scatter the seeds of legend.